Welcome to the Friends of the Missouri State Archives Thursday evening speaker series. The Friends are responsible for putting these programs together, and anyone here that want to become a member, there are forms in the back. Those that are online can join by visiting the Friends website at www.friendsofmsa.org. As always, there will be no program in December. We invite you to join us here at the Missouri State Archives for the 2026 Thursday evening speaker series. It will begin on January 15th at 7 p.m. with Michelle Brooks' presentation on historic Jefferson City hotels. While the capital city grew from a frontier wilderness, hotels were an anchor, such as the 80-year City Hotel. These substantial structures also housed community social events, from ladies' teas at the Central Hotel to dances behind the farmer's home, and civic meetings, from organizing to build a bridge across the Missouri River to political debates. Some of the city's most scintillating moments occurred at these gathering places, including the Pulitzer shooting, the surrender of Frank James, and the visit of a Russian Grand Duke. Tonight, we welcome back to the archives Dr. Brooks Blevins. Brooks Blevins is the Noel Boyd Professor of Ozark Studies at Missouri State University. He published with the University of Illinois Press his capstone work, 3 volumes constituting the definitive history of the Ozarks. He is also the author or editor of 10 other books, including Arkansas, How Bear Hunters, Hillbillies, and Good Old Boys Defined a State. In 2023, an article by Blevins was published in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly on the Ozark Origins of the Grand Ole Opry, and that is the topic for his presentation tonight. So please join me in welcoming Brooks Blevins to the Missouri State Archives.
All right, thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the Friends of the Archives for having me back. Apparently, it's been long enough since I was here last time where you kind of forgot how I was. Yeah, and so it'll be another few years before you invite me back after this one. But this is kind of a timely thing when Maeve contacted me about doing something this month. It just so happened that that this month corresponds with a very important milestone, anniversary in our music history in the United States. On November 28th of this month, we will mark the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Grand Ole Opry. It started November 28th, 1925 on WSM radio station in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I don't pay much attention to modern day country music, so I don't know if the folks in Nashville or the folks at the Grand Ole Opry today, the Grand Ole Opry is still going. It's still a radio show 100 years later. I don't know if they're making a big deal about the 100th anniversary. I assume they are. Why wouldn't you make a big fuss about 100 years or something? But I can almost guarantee you what you will not hear in the big fuss coming out of Nashville is anything that we talk about tonight. The Ozark Origins of the Grand Ole Opry. This is both an Arkansas and Missouri story. We'll spend a lot of our time talking about Arkansas, just barely over the state line. But this is just as much as we will see a Missouri story. So we get to combine the two main Ozark states in this story. So that's what we've got. We're going to look at really a story that most people don't know about. Some Nashville country music historians know about this story, but very little has ever been written about it. And And I'm going to tell you tonight the origin story of the Grand Ole Opry, according to the founder of the Grand Ole Opry, who traces his story back to the Ozarks. And I'll also tell you a little bit about how I discovered some of this stuff that people had not known about previously for the last 100 years. But we're not going to start in 1925 with this story. That would make too much sense, probably, to do that. We're going to start in a different era of American history, the good, I should say great 1980s. And here we are. This is Tom Cruise, if you can't tell that. You may recognize what movie that still is from. The greatest American movie of all time, Top Gun. I'm sure all of you will agree with me on that. So we're going to go back. We're actually not going to go back to 1986. It may not have been the greatest American movie of all time. It was the greatest teenage date movie of all time. This is the first movie that I ever took a girl to for a movie. And we are still married to this day. So it worked, and I don't care what you say. This is still the greatest date movie of all time, at least. So we're going to start in 1987, and the reason I've got Tom Cruise in his Navy Top Gun outfit up there is because 1987, we know if you keep up with the Oscars, the Academy Awards, you know that the 1987 Academy Awards are obviously going to be about movies from 1986. And it just so happens that the 1987 Academy Awards had a very strong Ozark presence, probably stronger than we've ever had before. And it wasn't because of Brad Pitt. He was just starting his career at that time, and he wasn't nominated for an Academy Award for any movie in 1986. One guy who was nominated was the guy who co-wrote the music for this movie. His name was Tom Whitlock. He was from Springfield, Missouri. I think he graduated from Drury University. We have any Drury alums in here. And Whitlock was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Song. And it was the theme song or the love song from this movie. It was called Take My Breath Away, performed by a group called Berlin that we've never heard of since that song. But it was the number one song of 1986. And Springfield's Tom Whitlock co-wrote that song and was nominated for an Oscar that year. He didn't win, but he wasn't the only person with Springfield ties who was nominated for an Oscar that year. A woman named Kathleen Turner, whom many of you will remember, who had Springfield ties and who went to school at SMS, now Missouri State University, where I worked. She was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actress that year for Peggy Sue Got Married, and some of you will remember that movie. Nicolas Cage was in that movie, so you know it's great. And also that year, we're not really interested in Tom Whitlock or Kathleen Turner as much as we are this third person, this third Ozarker who was nominated for an Academy Award. There we go. Maybe it won't. And that was a woman named Tess Harper. Tess was also a person who went to SMS, Missouri State University, but she was actually from a small town in Arkansas called Mammoth Spring. And most of you probably know, well, I shouldn't assume things because it is a ways off, but how many of you have been to Thayer, Missouri, and Mammoth Spring before? Okay, so we got about half the people have been down there. Thayer, Missouri is on the Arkansas border. Mammoth Spring is on the Missouri border. And so they're just sister cities, and they literally, their city limits touch each other. But Tess Harper was from the Mammoth Spring side. She was nominated for an Academy Award that year for Best Supporting Actress for a movie that I have not seen called Crimes of the Heart. I think it's one of those kind of weeper. Yeah, it is. I didn't want to say chick flick, but since somebody else volunteered, it is definitely in the Steel Magnolias mold. It is a chick flick, and I have not seen it. My wife has probably seen it when I was not around, I guess. But But she was in that movie. She didn't win an Academy Award either. I think I said Tom Whitlock didn't win. Tom Whitlock actually did win. I don't want to short him. The two women from the Ozarks did not win their Academy Awards. Tom Whitlock did. But Tess Harper is our back door into our story. This was the spring of 1987 when they had the Oscars. I think it was in March or maybe early April. And the TV show Entertainment Tonight, which still comes on after more than 40 years. I haven't seen it in years, but I just looked it up on the Google machine to make sure that it still comes on, and it does. Entertainment Tonight decided in the spring of '87, we're going to go to Mammoth Spring, Arkansas, and we're going to set up a big screen TV, however they did big screen TVs back in 1987. And we're going to invite the whole town of Mammoth Spring to come and watch Tess Harper walk the red carpet and watch the Academy Awards. And so they did that. It was kind of an all shucks moment where we get to see small town America, and then Entertainment Tonight showed this on their TV show. After all the publicity that this tiny little town of fewer than 1,000 people got, the brand new mayor of Mammoth Spring, the first woman mayor of Mammoth Spring, Jean Pace, went on the radio just a couple days later. The radio stations across the state line in Thayer, they just sort of share everything. She went on the radio station in Thayer, and she gave kind of like a fireside chat to listeners there. And she said, you know, I don't think our future here as a small town here in the Ozarks is in manufacturing or anything like that. We need to strike while the iron is hot. We need to focus on tourism. So if anybody has any ideas for us how we could attract tourists to Mammoth Spring, other than this gigantic spring that we have in this state park, and people already know about that, then please tell me. Well, the next day, this guy named Bob Ross shows up at her office. Not that Bob Ross. That would have been really exciting if it had been the artist Bob Ross. But this was a different Bob Ross, a retired military guy who lived in maybe Thayer or Mammoth, somewhere around there. So he comes in Mayor Pace's office and he says, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but my wife read a book written by the founder of the Grand Ole Opry. And in that book, he said that the inspiration for his creation of the Grand Ole Opry was a hoedown that he went to in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. And Mayor Pace had never heard the story, and most of the people she talked to in Mammoth Spring had never heard the story. Some old-timers had heard it, but by this time the book had been out for years, and it just sort of slipped people's minds. It was just something that people had forgotten about. It was let's see if that's going to, oh, that way, okay. There it is. Here's a picture of the book. This is actually the second edition. There's the founder of the Grand Ole Opry. His name was George D. Hay. The book that he wrote, this was originally published in 1945. So just on the 20-year anniversary of the founding of the Grand Ole Opry, George D. Hay wrote this book. He self-published it. So there are not many copies of it out there in circulation. The first issue that came out in 1945 was just a little really, really cheap paperback thing. The second one that's pictured here that came out in the early 50s was still a cheap paperback, just not quite as cheap as the first one. But in that book, about halfway through, Hay wasn't a historian. And so he wasn't thinking and writing like a historian. He waits till about halfway through the book to explain the origins of the Grand Ole Opry. And he does just kind of in haphazard fashion, about 3 or 4 paragraphs. He mentions that after World War I, he had been sent by his newspaper. At the time, he was a newspaper reporter for the Memphis Commercial Appeal. And the Memphis Commercial Appeal had sent him to Mammoth Spring, Arkansas to attend the burial of a Marine who had been killed in World War I. And so this was what we knew about the founding, the origin of the Grand Ole Opry. If you go back and read that today, what you'll see is there are almost no details whatsoever in his account. He doesn't give the name of the Marine. He doesn't tell exactly where the hoedown was. He describes that at the hoedown there was this country fiddler, this poor farmer that he had met near the state line, and that he went to the hoedown. There were about 20 people there. He doesn't name the fiddler. There are no details in this whatsoever, except he describes this log cabin that was, quote, hard by the Missouri line. So he says, we were about a mile up a muddy road outside of Mammoth Spring, hard by the Missouri line. And that's all anybody knew about this log cabin hoedown that had apparently inspired the creation of the Grand Ole Opry. So when the folks in Mammoth Spring read this, kind of refamiliarize themselves with this story after more than 40 years, Mayor Pace gets excited. She contacts the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. They find people who know about the story because they find people who've read this, just like we can read it today. But Nashville has, as you would expect, never made much of a big deal about that story. And so the Grand Ole Opry doesn't do much other than just put the folks in Mammoth Spring in touch with a historian, a guy named Charles K. Wolfe. Wolfe was actually an English professor at Middle Tennessee State University, who was also a graduate of SMS, Missouri State University, and was born in Sedalia, Missouri. So we had another Missourian involved in this whole Grand Ole Opry story. And Charles K. Wolfe at the time was the foremost expert on the history of the Grand Ole Opry. And so Charles K. Wolfe wrote the folks in Mammoth Spring a letter and said, yeah, there looks like there's a lot of evidence that you can make a case that Mammoth Spring provided the inspiration for the creation of the Grand Ole Opry. But that's about as far as it went. The Grand Ole Opry didn't send the welcome wagon over to Arkansas to make a big deal about this. And nothing else really happened from the Grand Ole Opry side of things. But Mayor Pace said, we can't let this opportunity go by. We've got to do something with this and sort of stir up some tourism and visitors over this. So what she did was put together a brainstorming committee, just an informal committee of local folks there in the area, to brainstorm and figure out how to capitalize on this Grand Ole Opry thing. Two of the members of the committee were musicians. One of them was from Oregon County, Missouri. The other one was from there in Arkansas. And these two musicians got together and they wrote a musical play that they called The Blue Skies of Arkansas. It was based on taken directly from a line in Hayes' book, The Blue Skies of Arkansas. And so they created this play, and then they decided that the play would be part of a bigger weekend festival. Every small town in the world has created and tried a festival at some time or another. Some of them are still going, some of them aren't. This one, unfortunately, is not still going. But in the summer of 1988, they launched this festival called the Solemn Old Judge Days. Solemn Old Judge was the nickname of George D. Hay. And the capstone of the Solemn Old Judge Days was a musical play called The Blue Skies of Arkansas. And they had a local fiddler who played the fiddler who was the first musician to actually play on the first show of the Grand Ole Opry. And this local musician would eventually go on to play on the Grand Ole Opry himself, and is quite a well-known fiddler by the name of Tim Crouch. And so this is what they did. It was just kind of a typical small-town festival, antiques and car shows and quilts and pancake breakfast and cornhole tournaments and all that kind of stuff, eventually a 5K. But they did this up until 2015. That was the last year that Solemn Old Judge Days took place. But really, it was a festival that didn't really send out the message in the way that the folks of Mammoth Spring had hoped. It didn't really create a lot of tourism and interest over the origins of the Grand Ole Opry. And part of that was because the folks in Mammoth Spring, while they put together the festival and they did the musical and all that kind of stuff for a few years, they didn't bring in a historian to actually do the research to find out the real story behind George D. Hay's account. A lot of country music historians over the years just assumed that George D. Hay was making up most of this stuff. He was a raconteur, and he was the kind of guy who didn't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And so a lot of historians just assumed that this was some kind of apocryphal story that he had made up as a romantic backstory for the creation of the Grand Ole Opry, and that it probably didn't happen, or that it mostly didn't happen the way that he claimed it happened in very vague language in his book. So nobody ever actually did the research for this, and nobody, all these years that this small town festival was going on and the play was happening, nobody knew the story behind this, or even if it had ever happened. Had George D. Hay even visited Mammoth Spring? We didn't really know. We didn't know the name of the Marine, who that person was. They finally decided that it must be a fallen Army soldier that the local American Legion post had been named after, even though Hay had said it was a Marine whose burial he attended. So all this is going on in the background, and we don't know many details at all, even at the time that the Solemn Old Judge Days ends in 2015. Now I probably should have put this up earlier just for your information, but here you can see Thayer and Mammoth. This makes it look like they're separated by a couple miles. They're really not. Their city limits just butt right up against the state line. They're just kind of right there next to each other. But that's what we're talking about. And here's Myatt Creek. I'll mention Myatt Creek here in a minute. And we'll see a different map here toward the end of this presentation too. So that's where we are. We don't know much about what's going on, but we've got a small town festival going on, and the country music world is still not paying any attention to the Mammoth Spring origin story of the Grand Ole Opry. Well, it was during the early part of the pandemic when I was sitting in my office one day, and as any of my students can tell you, my office is a wreck. I'm not an organized person. I could not be an archivist. I really, really appreciate what archivists do, but that's not my calling. And I just kind of live in a tornado mess all the time. And inside that tornado mess, I found an old note card, like we used to take notes on back in the days before we had laptops and all that kind of stuff. I found this old note card. And on that note, I don't know why it was there. I don't know how it got loose from where it was supposed to be, because it wasn't supposed to be there. But on that note card, I had scribbled something about George D. Hay and a Marine's funeral. And at the time, I wasn't working on this. This was my entry into working on this project. I had just finished my trilogy on the history of the Ozarks. And when I came across this note card, I thought, well, that might be something worth looking into, because I vaguely remembered this solemn old judge days going on in Mammoth Spring. I never went to it, but I grew up about 45 minutes from there, so it was kind of in my memory bank somewhere. And I thought, why did I scribble this down? And I'd scribbled it down like about around the year 2000, so it was an old note card. It had been there for a while, and so I used what little information was on that note card to launch my exploration of this story. And so I visited archives, very important for historians. We've got to have those. I visited a couple of archives. I visited a university library or two, got into some old newspapers, microfilm newspapers and things like that. And I discovered something that sort of started to open this thing up. For one, using this little snippet of a newspaper story that I had written down, I discovered the name of the Marine. And this is him. This was a real guy. Hay wasn't making this up. He did go to the funeral of a fallen Marine. Corporal Oscar Moore the 5th Marines, the Devil Dogs, if anybody is an old Marine in here. Moore was from Arkansas. He was from that same general area, had grown about 30 miles outside of Mammoth Spring. And he had been killed in June of 1918 at the Battle of Belleau Wood, a very important battle, really the first big battle that U.S. troops were involved in a serious way in. And it's the battle where the 5th Marines got their nickname, the Devil Dogs. They were supposedly given that nickname by the Germans, who called them Teufelshunde. Marine historians are not so sure that that's exactly how it happened, but still today they're the Devil Dogs. But he was wounded in that battle, and he died 8 days later. I'm sure in excruciating pain. He, like so many troops, he contracted gangrene, and he died 8 days after being wounded in the battle. But what I discovered and what I didn't know, and I've been a historian for pretty much my entire adult life, and I did not know this as an American historian. What I discovered is that part of the reason that historians had doubted the veracity of George D. Hay's story is because they didn't have the year right. They didn't know what year he had visited Mammoth Spring. He didn't tell them what year in that book, and people assumed the wrong year. What year did World War I end? 1918. 2 days ago, Armistice Day. We just had Armistice Day on Tuesday, Veterans Day now. It ended on November 11th, 1918. And so historians had assumed, well, if he's going to the burial of a fallen soldier after World War I, this must have taken place in 1919. That would be about how long it would take, them to get the caskets back across the Atlantic and to do all that kind of stuff. Well, in fact, none of the fallen troops were buried in the United States in 1919. It didn't happen until 1921. At the end of World War I, General Pershing, speaking of more Missourians who are involved in this story, General Pershing had wanted to leave the fallen Americans where they were buried in France, most of them buried in France, as a show of solidarity with our allies in Europe. And it had never been, of course, the United States had not been really in any massive foreign wars at that time. So there was really no precedence for what to do with these tens of thousands of fallen troops who were buried on foreign soil. But American families had other ideas and lobbied Congress to get their loved ones, the bodies of their loved ones, brought back to the United States so they could bury them on home soil. And eventually, Pershing relented, and they made arrangements where any family could request the remains of their son or their husband or their brother to be brought back across. And so that's what happened. The Moore family requested that Corporal Oscar Moore's remains be brought back from France. And he was buried here in late June of 1921, almost 3 years to the day after he was killed. He was buried in a small cemetery about 30 miles outside of Mammoth Spring. So that's what Hay was talking about. That was the burial that he went to. He wasn't making it up. So what I was able to do was to go again to the archives. In this case, it was in Arkansas, and follow. Thank goodness for small-town newspapers, right? These are newspapers that have not been digitized and probably will not be for years to come. So it was microfilm newspapers I was looking at. But the small-town newspaper in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas, apparently kept tabs on any newcomers who came to town, because in that newspaper, they mentioned that George D. Hay had gotten off the train in Mammoth Spring. And he got off the train on June 28th, 1921, the same day that Corporal Moore's body arrived in Mammoth Spring. George D. Hay did not come with the body. He came from Memphis with a group of boys from the Memphis YMCA and with their chaperones, their adult chaperones. He just kind of, I guess since they all got on the train in Memphis, they all came up together. And he got off the train in Mammoth Spring, and he went with the YMCA boys and their chaperones to a YMCA camp on Myatt Creek, about 10 miles outside of Mammoth Spring, and that's where they camped. That's where he stayed while he was in the area. The newspaper had all this information in it. And the next day, on June 29th, they went to the funeral. Now, one of the questions I had is, why is all this stuff happening in Mammoth Spring when Corporal Moore grew up 30 miles away? He actually grew up in a different county, not even in the same county. He grew up in my home county, in Ozark County, Arkansas. Why is Mammoth Spring involving itself? Well, the most obvious reason, this was the nearest railroad depot to the cemetery where they were going to bury him. So they were doing all this transporting bodies around the United States by rail, and so that's where they brought him. The less obvious answer was Mammoth Spring has a long kind of martial tradition dating back to the days of blue and gray reunions in the late 1800s. The North Arkansas and South Missouri reunion that started in 1890 eventually had its permanent headquarters in Mammoth Spring, at the spring. That's where they would meet every year, every August, and they would be there for almost a week. U.S. veterans, Confederate veterans, they would get together and play baseball and march around and listen to music and swim and all that kind of stuff. And because of this, the young men who had grown up in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas, had grown up with this kind of martial military spirit and were very gung-ho military. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, there was just a big rush of them in Mammoth Spring to volunteer and go to the war in a way that you didn't see in most other small towns around the country. And because of this martial tradition, martial spirit in Mammoth Spring, because it was the closest depot to the cemetery, Mammoth Spring became kind of headquarters for this. And it was the local American Legion post and the local booster club, kind of like the Kiwanis or something. They weren't called the Kiwanis, they were called the Commercial Club. But it was the local boosters and the local American Legionnaires who headed up this effort to formally accept the remains of Corporal Moore, make sure that he's eulogized in a little church in Mammoth Spring. Then they load the casket into the back of a truck and head down the road 30 miles to the cemetery where he's going to be buried in a little community called Union, Arkansas. And what also became apparent to me when I was doing this research was that this whole kind of community theatrical burying of a fallen soldier got kind of caught up in the culture wars of the early 1920s. We can look back at that era as a pretty good analog for our own day and time and our own culture wars. A lot of the same kinds of things were in the air in the early 1920s. There was a lot of this bickering and sort of back and forth between worldviews and things that were happening in the early 1920s. And the American Legion was right in the middle of it. The American Legion became one of the kind of great entities for ferreting out Reds, for trying to clamp down on what they feared was this growing communist spirit in the early 1920s. And so this is all going on in the background of this story. And the boosters and the American Legionnaires are all kind of getting caught up in this. And I think that played a role in why Mammoth Spring was really gung-ho on seeing Corporal Moore buried in the way he was. The The burial, as I said, did not take place in Mammoth Spring. It took place 30 miles away. This is the stone. This is Corporal Moore's stone. If you're driving down Arkansas Highway 9 today, in the little rural community of Union, there's nothing there but a church and some houses today and this big cemetery. And if you look at that cemetery, the tallest tombstone in the cemetery to this day is this one. It's Corporal Moore's military stone. And that's where he was buried, and that's where George D. Hay attended the funeral that he says brought him to the Ozarks, and that eventually inspired his creation of the Grand Ole Opry. This is the little church where the funeral took place. I'm not sure of this. Let's see. The funeral took place right down here. Just right on the line. So you can see Mammoth Spring is way up here. Probably took them at least a couple hours to make that drive back in those days. The roads would have been terrible, and they were in old flivvers and things. But that's where it took place. So the rest of George D. Hay's story is that after he went to this graveside burial, that he went back to Mammoth Spring, or actually he went back to the YMCA camp just outside of Mammoth Spring. He wrote his story up for the Memphis Commercial Appeal. He had to go to Mammoth Spring to wire the story down to Memphis. And after he wired the story to Memphis, and we don't know how many days after this it happened, the local paper wasn't keeping up with that. They pretty much ignored George D. Hay after the funeral. But he went back, he wired his story, and that's when he said he was just kind of gandering around town when he encountered a poor farmer who he said lived with his family in an old boxcar almost on the state line. And they had a bunch of kids, but the old farmer was a fiddler. And the old farmer invited Hay to a hoedown that night, again, a mile up a muddy road and hard by the Missouri line, wherever that was. And so Hay decided to go with him. And he said that about 20 people showed up. There was a fiddler, there was a banjo player, and a guitar player. And he says the folks danced and sang and had so much fun that night that he filed it away in his memory. And from the very beginning of the Grand Ole Opry, that was his inspiration for the Grand Ole Opry. Now we could I won't go into how some historians might still doubt that, because the Grand Ole Opry was not the first radio barn dance. The barn dance format was created a couple years before the Grand Ole Opry came on the air. So you can argue that Hay was just copying off of other barn dances if you want to. But we do know that George D. Hay did almost everything that he said he did in his little booklet. And that we now know the details of where he went and who was buried. We still don't know exactly who the fiddler was. I've got a pretty good idea who it was because of something else. One of the things that I noticed when I was talking to people in the year or so that I was working on this story is that nobody seemed to know where the house was. That's what I was wondering so much at the time. It was where did this happen? Because if that house is still around, that would be something. That's where your tourism could come in. You know, people come and visit the house and all that kind of stuff. But when I talked to people in Mammoth Spring, either they didn't know, or one person pointed at a root cellar that maybe 3 of us could fit in. I'm not sure that we could or not, but it's certainly not big enough place to have a hoedown, and it wasn't a log cabin, but that, you know, he could have made that part up. But nobody seemed to know where it was until I stumbled across somebody from Thayer, Missouri. And on the Thayer side of the line, some people seemed to know where the Opry House was. While mysteriously on the Arkansas side of the line, people had decided, well, we don't know exactly where it is. And why do you think that was? Yeah, it was so hard by the Missouri line that he was probably in Missouri. The Opry Origin House is most likely on the Missouri side of the line in what would be Thayer, or what would have been Thayer at that time. And so I found an old 1971 article from the Thayer, Missouri newspaper, the weekly newspaper there, in which a local woman by the name of Pearl Dawson had said, I was at that hoedown and I met George D. Hay when I was 15 years old. And she even identified one of the musicians there, the guitar player, who she said was named William Whiteside. And when I did research on William Whiteside, I discovered that his father was a noted local fiddler. And I wouldn't be surprised if his dad was the fiddler at that hoedown. But I was still wondering, where is it possible that this Opry house is still around, that the hoedown house still exists? And I finally made contact with a couple people on the Missouri side, and one of them is retired from MSU West Plains, a retired art teacher and artist. And she knew Pearl Dawson. This woman, when she was a child, she knew Pearl Dawson, and she knew the house that Pearl had said, that's where I met George D. Hay when I was a teenager. He was at a hoedown here in town. And so she took me to the house, and it's still there. If it's the one that Pearl Dawson said it was, if she was correct that this is the house where the hoedown took place, well, that's it. It's a little worse for the wear today, as you can tell. It's not occupied. The last occupant of that house, unfortunately, was murdered, and it's a little bit of a rough-looking area. It's on a dirt road called State Line Road. We're sort of, I think when I took this picture, I was standing in the middle of the dirt road, so I was sort of right on the state line, because the State Line Road is literally built on the state line. If you hop to the south side, you're in Arkansas. The north side, you're in Missouri. But that's on the north side of the road, and that's where Pearl Dawson said it was. So I got to thinking, I wanted to know, first of all, I wanted to know who owned the house, and what was the story of this house? Is it old enough to have been around in 1921? And so I went to the county courthouse in Alton, Missouri, and went through some old records. And it turns out that the house belonged to members of Pearl Dawson's family. So she probably knew what she was talking about if she claimed that's where the hoedown took place, and she was there. It was her sister and her brother-in-law who owned the house. But not long before that, Pearl's father had owned the house. He had died less than a year before Hay visited Mammoth Spring and Thayer. And what I didn't expect to find out was, did somebody say moonshine? Did I hear a moonshine out there? You just assume that it's the Ozarks and there must be a moonshine angle to this story. Well, it turns out there is. Assumptions sometimes work out. Pearl Dawson's father was a guy named T.V. Marshall, Thomas Vance Marshall, and he was the most notorious moonshiner and bootlegger on the state line down there. And from what I can tell, this house would have been kind of the heart of his illicit operation. And quite likely still was in 1921, this is still early in the Prohibition era, which, if you start sort of putting things together, it's very possible, maybe even probable, that George D. Hay wasn't at a log cabin somewhere out in the country. George D. Hay was a 25-year-old single young man in 1921, and any single man wandering the streets of Thayer or Mammoth Spring in 1921 could easily have found out where to go to get a drink and have a good time, and that would have been in this neighborhood of Thayer, the Old Town neighborhood of Thayer, Missouri, and maybe specifically in the old Marshall house, the center of T.V. Marshall's illicit bootlegging and moonshining operation. And so it's probably not too much of a stretch to think this kind of puts a different spin on the origin of the Grand Ole Opry. So maybe the historians were right all those years, and maybe when George D. Hay was writing his origin story, it was romantic in a way. It may not have happened at a log cabin. It may have happened at a blind tiger, at a speakeasy in Prohibition days in Thayer, Missouri, the old town neighborhood of Thayer, Missouri. So at this point, it seems like the most likely candidate we have for an actual location of the hoedown that George D. Hay himself inspired his vision for the Grand Ole Opry. It was in the Ozarks, as he said, probably not in Arkansas, as he said. He may not have known what state he was in, you know. Who would if you just wondered if you walked up there? And he could have been in such a mental state that he may have not. I don't know. I don't know George D. Hay's personal, peccadillos, but it is part of the story that, that we get this unexpected end of potentially this unexpected Ozark Opry House, not in the way that anyone thought, and certainly not in the way that George D. Hay described it in his booklet that he published in 1945. But that is Hay, and that's a picture that's supposedly from the very first broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry. It wasn't called the Grand Ole Opry when it first came on the air, November 28th, 1925. But a couple years later, George D. Hay renamed it the Grand Ole Opry. It was originally just called the Barn Dance, and he renamed it the Grand Ole Opry a couple of years later. But that's the story, and we'll probably never know for sure if that's really the house. I mean, Pearl Dawson claimed it was, and there were other people in Thayer who believed that was the Opry House as well. But a lot of the details 100 years later will remain fuzzy probably. But we know a lot more about the origin story told by George D. Hay than we did just a few years ago. And we know that it's not all made up. A lot of this actually did happen. It's probably not going to make any difference to folks in Nashville. It's still a long ways from Nashville, and just kind of a colorful, quaint little story. But it's too bad the folks in Mammoth Spring and Thayer aren't still doing their solemn old judge days, and they don't have their little Hall of Fame that they used to have for several years. They had a little Hall of Fame in a Quonset hut there, and it's kind of going under now. But that's the story of George D. Hay and the secret, as heretofore untold origins of the Grand Ole Opry, from as far as we can tell at this point. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.